You actually came, David sneered, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He leaned against the velvet-draped balcony, the heavy gold crown catching the chandelier's light. I thought you would be too ashamed to show your face at my son's naming ceremony. Tell me, Lisa, how does it feel to look at a true family, knowing your womb was too cold to give me one? Lisa did not flinch. She simply adjusted the silken cuff of her emerald gown, a serene smile curving her lips as the grand mahogany doors behind her began to swing open. I wouldn't know, Your Majesty, she replied, her voice soft enough to force him to lean in, yet sharp enough to draw blood. But I brought my own family to celebrate. The grand banquet hall of the Silvercrest Pack was a masterclass in opulent intimidation. Towering pillars of black marble stretched toward a vaulted ceiling painted with the triumphs of ancient werewolf kings. Thousands of flickering candles cast a warm, golden glow over the elite members of the supernatural aristocracy, all gathered to celebrate the second birthday of Alpha King David's only heir. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes, roasted meats, and the underlying heavy musk of shifting loyalties. David sat upon his gilded throne, his posture a portrait of practiced arrogance. To his right sat Victoria, his chosen queen, her delicate hands fussing over a squirming, whimpering toddler in her lap. 5 years ago, David had made the most difficult and pragmatic decision of his reign. He had dragged Lisa, his fated mate, before this very court. After 3 years of agonizing silence from her womb, he had publicly severed their bond, declaring her barren, unfit to carry the royal bloodline. He recalled the way she had wept silently, the way her scent of rain and crushed lavender had soured with heartbreak before she vanished into the night. He had invited her tonight out of a dark, lingering need for closure. He wanted her to witness the prosperity of his reign, to see the son Victoria had given him. He wanted validation that his cruelty had been necessary for the good of the kingdom. When the heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the hall unlatched with a resonating clack, the low hum of aristocratic chatter died instantly. A collective breath was drawn and held. Lisa stepped over the threshold. The woman who entered was not the fragile, broken girl David had exiled. She wore a tailored gown of deep emerald silk that moved like liquid glass around her striking silhouette. Her dark hair, once kept long and unruly, was styled in a sleek, immaculate cut that emphasized the sharp, aristocratic lines of her jaw and cheekbones. There was no grief in her posture, no hesitation in her stride. She moved with the devastating grace of a queen who needed no crown to command a room. David's breath caught in his throat. He leaned forward, his fingers tightening around the ornate armrests of his throne. He opened his mouth, perhaps to issue a mocking welcome, to remind her of her place. But the words died on his tongue as the shadows behind the massive doorway began to shift. She had not come alone. Stepping out of the darkness of the antechamber, moving in perfect, terrifying synchronization, were 4 young boys. They appeared to be no older than 4 or 5, yet they possessed none of the clumsy, chaotic energy of children. They wore immaculate, matching suits of charcoal gray, tailored flawlessly to their small frames. As they stepped into the candlelight, a collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of gathered wolves. Glasses slipped from trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor. The boys were identical. They possessed hair as dark as a raven's wing, swept back with immaculate precision. But it was their eyes that caused the blood to drain from David's face. 4 pairs of piercing, glacial, silver-gray eyes swept over the room. They were David's eyes. They were the eyes of the Silvercrest bloodline, a genetic marker so rare it only appeared in the ruling monarch. But it was not merely their appearance that paralyzed the room. It was the weight of the air around them. Werewolf pups did not develop their alpha auras until adolescence. It was a biological rule, an undisputed fact of their kind. Yet, as the 4 identical boys flanked their mother, 2 on her left and 2 on her right, the atmospheric pressure in the grand hall plummeted. The scent of ozone, petrichor, and freezing mountain air, the undeniable, suffocating pheromones of apex predators, rolled over the crowd like an avalanche. It was not one alpha aura. It was 4. Dense, ancient, and wildly unnatural for their age. Lisa paused in the center of the Crimson Runner. She did not look at the gossiping lords or the terrified ladies. She looked directly into David's wide, trembling eyes, her serene smile never faltering. The kingdom David had built on the foundation of her supposed inadequacy was suddenly standing on a precipice, and Lisa had just handed the wind a hammer. The silence in the grand hall was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. The shattering of a single crystal goblet against the marble floor echoed like a gunshot, but not a single head turned to see who had dropped it. Every eye in the kingdom was fixed on the 5 figures standing at the center of the Crimson Runner. David's knuckles turned bone white as he gripped the arms of his throne. A low, involuntary growl vibrated in his chest, a primal reaction to the overwhelming threat of foreign alpha presences in his territory. Yet his wolf, the beast that had driven him to conquer rival packs and expand his borders, was not urging him to fight. It was whining. Beside him, Victoria froze. The fussy toddler in her lap, sensing the sudden shift in the room's energy, let out a piercing, terrified wail. Victoria shushed him frantically, her eyes darting between the 4 miniature kings standing below and the pale, rigid profile of her mate. "David," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling. "David." "Who are they?" David could not answer. He could not breathe. Logic dictated that what he was seeing was impossible. Lisa had been barren. The royal physicians had confirmed it. The elders had decreed it. Yet the undeniable truth was standing 20 feet away, radiating a power that made his own skin prickle with cold sweat. Lisa took another step forward, her heels clicking cleanly against the marble. The 4 boys moved with her, a flawless escort. They did not gawk at the chandeliers. They did not flinch at the wailing child on the throne. Their silver eyes remained fixed on David, analyzing him with a chilling, detached calculation. Elder Marcus, a grizzled wolf who had served David's father, stepped forward from the front row of the audience. His instincts, honed by decades of war and pack politics, betrayed him. As Lisa and the boys approached, the old warrior involuntarily lowered his head, exposing his neck in a deep, respectful bow. A ripple of shock went through the courtiers. The elders only bowed to the reigning monarch. "Elder Marcus," Lisa acknowledged, her voice a soothing melody that cut through the oppressive tension. "It is a pleasure to see you in good health. Your left knee seems to be troubling you less these days." Marcus blinked, looking up in astonishment that she remembered such a trivial detail after half a decade of exile. Thank you, Lady Lisa. The mountain herbs you recommended before your departure, they were quite effective. I am glad," she murmured gracefully, before turning her gaze back to the dais. She stopped at the base of the throne steps. The boys halted exactly 1/2 step behind her, their postures impeccably straight, hands folded neatly behind their backs. The contrast between them and the weeping, thrashing 2-year-old in Victoria's arms was a spectacle of devastating proportions. "Your Majesty," Lisa said, her tone devoid of mockery, devoid of anger. It was perfectly, agonizingly polite. "You extended an invitation to my person, requesting my presence to witness the strength of your legacy. I have come to offer my congratulations." David's jaw worked. He forced his hands to uncurl from the throne. He needed to assert dominance. He was the Alpha King. He needed to project power before his pack began to question the very fabric of his reality. "Lisa," David managed, his voice dropping an octave, laced with an artificial rumble of authority. "You have returned, and you have brought guests. Do you care to explain the meaning of this theatrical display?" He tried to push his aura outward, a heavy wave of dominant pine and smoke, meant to force the room into submission and remind the strangers whose hall they stood in. It washed over the crowd, causing several weaker wolves to drop to their knees. The wave hit Lisa. Before it could even ruffle the silk of her gown, the four boys subtly shifted their stances. They did not growl. They did not bare their teeth. They simply stared at David, and a collective, invisible wall of freezing ozone slammed into David's aura, shattering it instantly. David gasped quietly, the breath driven from his lungs by the sheer, unyielding resistance of the children. They hadn't attacked him. They had simply refused to be moved, their natural presence overpowering his deliberate exertion. Lisa tilted her head, her smile reaching her eyes for the first time. "Theatrical display. I assure you, David, there is no theater here. Only the truth you were too impatient to wait for." The scrambling of the royal staff was the only sound that broke the ensuing standoff. The head steward, reading the perilous political currents with the desperation of a drowning man, frantically signaled the footmen. Within seconds, 5 heavy, high-backed oak chairs were hurried to the most prominent position at the grand dining table, directly across from the royal family. Lisa moved toward the table with unhurried elegance. She did not sit immediately. She waited until one of her sons, the one standing on her far right, whose jaw was a fraction sharper than his brother's, stepped forward and pulled the heavy chair out for her. Only when she was seated did the 4 boys take their own places. Their manners were not just polished, they were militaristic in their precision. David felt a cold sweat breaking out at the nape of his neck. He practically dragged himself from the throne, Victoria trailing behind him, clutching their sniffling son, Julian. As David took his seat at the head of the table, he realized the geography of the room had fundamentally shifted. The courtiers, though seated at their respective tables, had physically leaned their chairs away from the king and toward the banished queen. Gravity itself had changed allegiances. The first course was served in agonizing silence. Silver clinked against fine porcelain. The roasted pheasant and spiced wine tasted like ash in David's mouth. He stared at the boys. Up close, the resemblance was violently undeniable. The aristocratic slope of their noses, the arch of their brows, the impossible silver gray of their irises. "They are well trained," David said softly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He desperately needed to categorize them, to diminish them. "Did you adopt them from the northern rogue territories, Lisa? I hear they breed them quite disciplined up there. A clever trick, using glamour magic to mimic the royal eye color." Victoria let out a shaky, triumphant breath, clinging to David's rationale. "Glamour magic," she whispered, stroking Julian's hair. "Of course. How pathetic." Lisa did not stop cutting her pheasant. She brought a delicate piece to her lips, chewed gracefully, and patted her mouth with a linen napkin. "I have no need for magic, David. Nor do I have need for tricks." "Then what are they?" David demanded, his voice finally cracking like a whip, his frustration bleeding through his regal facade. "Because 5 years ago, my physicians declared your body a wasteland. You were incapable of carrying a single pup, let alone 4. Before Lisa could answer, the boy sitting directly across from David placed his silver fork down on the table. The motion was slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of childish clumsiness. The boy looked up, meeting the Alpha King's furious gaze with terrifying placidity. "With respect, Your Majesty, The boy spoke. His voice was a soft, bell-like treble of a child, yet it carried the chilling, measured cadence of an ancient statesman. The fault did not lie in our mother's biology, but in the weakness of your blood. The entire hall collectively stopped breathing. A 5-year-old had just insulted the biological vitality of the Alpha King. Victoria gasped in outrage. "How dare you speak to the king?" "Quiet." David snarled at his mate, never breaking eye contact with the child. His chest heaved. "And what is your name, boy?" "I am Arthur," the child replied calmly. He interlaced his small fingers on the table. "And to answer your unspoken question, it requires immense, undisturbed magical latency to forge 4 alpha cores simultaneously. For 3 years, our mother's body was dedicating every ounce of its energy to our conceptualization, sheltering us from the hostile, stressful environment of a pack that despised her. Your physicians mistook a miracle of supernatural conservation for barrenness, because they, like you, lack the capacity to understand true power when it is gestating. David's mind spun. The logic was flawless, rooted in ancient shifter lore that only the highest echelon of the royal library contained. How could a child know this? How could a child articulate it with such devastating composure? "You are arrogant for a pup," David rumbled, leaning forward, trying to cast his imposing shadow over the table. Arthur did not shrink back. The boy sitting next to him, who had not spoken a word, simply reached over and picked up a heavy crystal water pitcher. With one hand, showing unnatural, terrifying strength for a toddler, the boy poured a glass of water for Arthur, utterly ignoring the king's threatening posture. "Arrogance is a flaw of those who must pretend to be strong, Your Majesty," Arthur replied, taking a polite sip of his water. "We are merely stating the facts. Our mother brought us here tonight not to challenge your throne, but to observe it. Thus far, we are profoundly underwhelmed." David stood up abruptly, his chair screeching violently against the marble. The screech of David's heavy oak chair dragging against the polished marble floor echoed like a war horn through the cavernous banquet hall. The sheer violence of the sound caused a visceral flinch to ripple through the seated courtiers. Silver cutlery clattered onto fine porcelain plates as dozens of elite werewolves instinctively braced for a physical altercation. The Alpha King stood at his full, imposing height, his broad chest heaving beneath his tailored midnight blue suit, his jaw locked in a rictus of suppressed fury. He stared down at the small, impeccably dressed 5-year-old sitting across from him. Arthur did not blink. The child merely looked back, his glacial, silver-gray eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight with a chilling, ancient stillness. The other 3 boys remained equally motionless, a terrifying tableau of synchronized calm. "David," Victoria whispered, her voice a fragile, desperate thread in the suffocating silence. She tugged at the sleeve of his jacket, her face pale as she clutched now sobbing Julian to her chest. "David, please. The pack is watching." Victoria's words, intended to ground him, only twisted the knife deeper into his ribs. The pack was indeed watching. David could feel the weight of 100 gazes pressing against his skin. He could smell their shifting pheromones, the sour tang of confusion, the sharp sting of fear, and, most damning of all, the subtle, earthy musk of awe directed not at him, but at the 4 miniature titans sitting across the table. If he struck a child, even one radiating such an impossible, defiant aura, he would lose the respect of the elders instantly. A true alpha did not need violence to command obedience from a pup. Yet, David felt entirely powerless to command the air in his own lungs, let alone the respect of these boys. "You speak of power, child," David said, forcing his voice to lower into a dangerous, rumbling baritone. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles bone-white. "But you do not understand the burden of the crown. You sit in my hall, eating my food, and dare to judge a reign you know nothing of." Lisa placed her silver knife gently across the rim of her plate. The delicate clink drew every eye in the room back to her. She looked up at her former mate, her expression one of polite, almost maternal pity. It was an expression that infuriated David more than outright hatred ever could. "They do not judge your reign, David," Lisa said smoothly, her voice a cool balm over the scorching tension in the room. "They merely observe its mechanics. As for your hospitality, we are profoundly grateful. But please, do not mistake our polite acceptance of your invitation for submission." She turned her gaze to her sons, a silent command passing between them. Instantly, as if orchestrated by a silent metronome, the dense, suffocating atmospheric pressure that had been pressing down on the hall vanished. The sudden absence of the boys' combined alpha auras left the room feeling strangely hollow, as if a great weight had been lifted off the chests of the courtiers. Several wolves audibly gasped for air, slumping slightly in their seats. "We are not here to disrupt your son's naming ceremony," Lisa continued, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "We came to pay our respects, to show that the past is entirely behind us. If our presence is too distressing for your queen, we can take our leave." It was a masterful, devastating maneuver. By offering to leave out of concern for Victoria's distress, Lisa framed herself as the gracious diplomat and painted the royal family as fragile and easily intimidated. David felt a cold bead of sweat slide down his spine. If she walked out now, taking those 4 identical miracles with her, the rumors would tear his kingdom apart. The elders would demand answers he did not have. The pack would whisper that the Alpha King had been terrified of his own bloodline. "No," David said sharply, perhaps a fraction too quickly. He swallowed hard, forcing his rigid muscles to relax, and slowly lowered himself back into his chair. "No one is leaving. It is a night of celebration. We will dine." Lisa offered a serene, devastatingly polite nod. "As you wish, Your Majesty." The remainder of the main course was a masterclass in psychological endurance. The elite members of the Silver Crest Pack conversed in hushed, nervous whispers, their eyes constantly darting toward the royal table. The 4 boys ate with mechanical precision, their manners flawless, their silence deafening. They did not play with their food, they did not fidget, and they did not acknowledge the whimpering toddler across from them. When the plates were finally cleared to make way for the dessert course, David knew he could not endure another hour of this public agonizing. He needed to fracture Lisa's impenetrable composure. He needed to understand the mechanics of this impossible reality away from the judgmental eyes of his court. "Lisa," David said, his voice stripped of its artificial rumble, leaving only a tight, strained rasp. "I would speak with you." In the antechamber. Alone, Victoria stiffened, her head snapping toward him, but David ignored her. His eyes were locked on his former mate. Lisa dabbed the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. She glanced at the boy sitting to her immediate left, the one with a slightly more observant, calculated gleam in his silver eyes. "Bennett," she murmured softly, "see to it that your brothers remain polite." "Yes, Mother," Bennett replied, his voice a soft, chiming echo of Arthur's terrifying composure. Lisa rose from her chair. She did not wait for David to lead the way. She simply turned and walked toward the heavy velvet drapes that concealed the private parlor adjacent to the banquet hall. David followed, acutely aware of the whispered speculations rising in his wake. The antechamber was dimly lit by a single chandelier, the air thick with the scent of old books and dried roses. The moment the heavy velvet curtains fell shut behind them, isolating them from the noise of the banquet, David rounded on her. The veneer of the Alpha King slipped, revealing the frantic, deeply shaken man beneath. "What kind of twisted game are you playing, Lisa?" David demanded, closing the distance between them. He wanted to grab her shoulders, to shake the truth out of her. But the sheer confidence in her posture repelled him like a physical barrier. "There is no game, David," she replied quietly. She stood by a massive arched window, the moonlight catching the emerald silk of her gown. "You asked me to come. You wanted to display your perfect life, your perfect son. I simply obliged. You hid them from me," he accused, his voice cracking with a sudden, overwhelming wave of grief and betrayal. The logic of his anger felt justified, yet incredibly hollow. "For 5 years, you let me believe you were Barren. You let me banish you into the winter woods, knowing you carried royal heirs." Lisa turned to face him, the serene smile finally fading from her lips, replaced by a cold, insurmountable logic. "I let you believe what your impatience demanded," she corrected softly. "I did not hide them, David. My body protected them from you." David took a step back, as if struck physically. "Protected them from me? I am their father. You are their sire," Lisa corrected, her tone polite but unyielding. "A father would have had the patience to wait. A father would have trusted the bond we shared. But you were terrified of looking weak before your elders. When my magic drew inward, halting my cycles to weave 4 alpha cores simultaneously, an act of biological triage your physicians were too foolish to recognize, you saw only failure. You humiliated me before the entire court. You severed our bond to save your pride." David opened his mouth, desperately searching for a defense, but the words evaporated. The memory of that night, the coldness in his own voice as he stripped her of her title, crashed over him. "I survived the winter, David," Lisa continued, her voice devoid of venom, which somehow made it hurt more. "I survived the rogue territories. I birthed 4 alpha heirs on a bed of pine needles, with no healers, no pack, and no king. They are my family. You are merely the man who threw us away." Before David could formulate a response to the devastating truth, the velvet curtains rustled. The boy named Bennett stepped into the dim light, his small hands clasped neatly behind his back. "Mother," Bennett said, his polite, even tone slicing through the heavy emotional atmosphere. "Forgive the intrusion, but Elder Marcus has brought forth the border dispute for the king's judgment, as is customary during the naming ceremony. I believe the king's presence is required." Lisa's serene smile returned instantly. She glided past David, entirely unaffected by his crumbling world. "Duty calls, Your Majesty," she murmured. The atmosphere in the great hall had shifted fundamentally by the time David returned to his throne. The tension was no longer merely a byproduct of the royal family's domestic drama. It had evolved into a political current. Standing before the dais was Alpha Thorn, a scarred, burly werewolf who managed the Silver Crest Pack's volatile eastern border. It was a long-standing tradition that during major royal celebrations, regional alphas could bring unresolved grievances directly to the king for an absolute ruling. David slumped into his throne, his mind reeling from the confrontation in the antechamber. Victoria reached out to touch his arm, but he flinched away, his eyes locked on Lisa and her 4 sons as they resumed their seats with terrifying, quiet grace. "Speak, Thorn," David ordered, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. He needed a distraction. He needed an opportunity to project strength, to remind the pack why he wore the crown. Alpha Thorn bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, the eastern river basin is drying up prematurely. The Silverhide clan on the opposite bank has begun crossing the shallow waters to hunt on our lands. My warriors have skirmished with them twice this week. We request your permission to mobilize a full battalion. We must strike their camps and force them back before they establish a permanent foothold on our territory." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. It was a classic display of strength. Pack law dictated that territorial incursions must be met with overwhelming force. It was the brutal, simple logic of wolves. David straightened his posture, leaning forward. This was familiar territory. This was where he excelled. "Permission granted, Thorn. Take 50 of the Royal Guard. Burn their forward camps. Let the smoke warn the rest of their clan that the Silver Crest border is absolute." Thorn grinned, a feral showing of teeth, and bowed again. "Thank you, my king." A profoundly inefficient allocation of resources. A soft, chiming voice echoed across the quiet hall. Thorn froze. David's head snapped toward the royal dining table. It was Bennett. The 5-year-old was carefully adjusting the cuffs of his miniature charcoal suit, entirely unbothered by the collective gasp that swept through the room. David's blood boiled. "You dare question a royal decree?" Bennett looked up, his silver eyes locking onto the burly border Alpha, completely ignoring the king's outburst. "Alpha Thorn, you stated the river basin is drying up prematurely. Have you investigated the cause?" Thorn blinked, looking from the child to the king, entirely unsure of how to proceed. It is a dry season, pup. Rivers dry. Rivers of that magnitude do not dry in early spring without geological interference," Bennett stated, his tone polite, educational, and absolutely devastating in its logic. "The Silverhide clan is not crossing to steal your game. They are crossing because whatever has dammed the river upstream has likely flooded their primary dens. They are refugees, not invaders." The hall fell dead silent. Even the elders leaned forward, their eyes wide with shock. The child was applying advanced topographical logic that their seasoned generals had entirely overlooked. "If you burn their camps," Bennett continued calmly, interlacing his fingers on the table, "you will force desperate wolves into a corner. They will fight to the death to protect their young, costing you dozens of your own warriors. You will inherit a poisoned river and a generational blood feud. What would you suggest, little lord?" Elder Marcus asked from the front row, his voice hushed with profound respect, completely bypassing the king's authority. Bennett tilted his head. "Offer them a temporary treaty. Allow them to hunt on the eastern ridge in exchange for their labor in dismantling the dam upstream. You secure a massive free workforce to restore your water supply. You prevent the loss of your own warriors, and you indebt a neighboring clan to the Silver Crest crown. True power, Alpha Thorn, is not how much blood you can spill. It is how much leverage you can acquire without lifting a single blade." The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the heavy, terrifying silence of the Alpha auras. It was the silence of profound, unadulterated awe. David sat paralyzed on his throne. He looked at Thorn, who was nodding slowly, the violent urge for war entirely replaced by the cold, undeniable brilliance of the child's strategy. He looked at the elders, who were whispering frantically among themselves, looking at Bennett with hungry, calculating eyes. In less than 3 minutes, a 5-year-old boy had not just challenged the king's ruling, he had rendered the king's entire philosophy of leadership obsolete. The banquet hall, once a theater of royal intimidation designed to humiliate a banished queen, had transformed into a classroom where the reigning monarch was the failing student. Following Bennett's flawless deconstruction of the border crisis, a strange, suffocating lethargy settled over David. He sat rigidly upon his gilded throne, watching the elite members of the Silver Crest Pack subtly but undeniably shift their physical orientation. Shoulders were angled toward the royal dining table. Glances were stolen not toward the crown, but toward the emerald-clad woman and her 4 impossible sons. Victoria, sensing the catastrophic shift in the room's gravity, felt a desperate, clawing panic rise in her chest. She was the queen. She had given the Alpha King his heir. Yet, as she clutched Julian, who was now blissfully asleep, exhausted from his earlier crying, she felt entirely invisible. The pack was mesmerized by the ghost of the past, unable to endure the agonizing shift in power. Victoria smoothed her expression into a mask of faux gracious concern. She leaned forward, projecting her voice so it would carry across the quiet hum of the hall. "Your political theories are certainly imaginative, little one," Victoria said, forcing a tight, patronizing smile toward Bennett. "But governing a kingdom requires more than clever words. It requires resources, protection. Tell me, Lisa, how do you manage such things out in the untamed rogue territories? It must be so dreadfully difficult, raising 4 growing boys without the safety of pack walls or the comfort of a royal treasury. Do you find yourself relying on the charity of passing traders?" It was a deliberate, pointed strike. Victoria was attempting to re-establish the hierarchy, reminding the court that regardless of how intelligent the boys were, they were still stateless rogues. And Lisa was still an exiled woman living in the dirt. Lisa paused, her crystal water goblet halfway to her lips. She took a slow, deliberate sip, her serene expression entirely unbothered by the venom in Victoria's tone. "Charity is a necessity only for those who cannot build their own infrastructure, Victoria," Lisa replied, her voice a soft, echoing chime in the vast hall. "We do not live in the dirt, nor do we require walls to feel safe." Before Victoria could issue a condescending retort, the boy sitting to Arthur's right, whose hair was parted slightly differently, revealing a sharp, intensely observant gaze, spoke up. "The assumption that the Silver Crest Pack provides superior security is mathematically flawed," the third boy stated. His voice, like his brother's, was unnervingly calm and devoid of childish inflection. David's jaw clenched. "And you are?" "Caleb," the boy answered politely, giving a minimal, seated bow of his head. He turned his glacial silver eyes toward Victoria. "You speak of a royal treasury, Queen Victoria. Yet, based on the silk of your gown, the rationing of the venison served tonight, and the slight tarnish on the armor of the palace guards, the Silver Crest economy has been operating at a 5% deficit for the past 3 fiscal quarters. The king's constant border skirmishes have drained your grain reserves to dangerously low levels." A collective gasp echoed from the tables housing the pack's financiers and merchants. Caleb had deduced state secrets from the fabric of a dress and the menu of a banquet. "Our mother did not require a treasury," Caleb continued, interlacing his fingers precisely. "She synthesized rare medicinal flora found only in the deep winter woods. She established a trade monopoly with the neutral merchant guilds of the eastern seaboard. The estate she built for us possesses a liquid asset valuation that currently eclipses the Silver Crest treasury by a factor of 3. We do not rely on charity. We dictate the market." Victoria's face drained of all color, leaving her porcelain skin a sickly, ashen white. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. The absolute, irrefutable logic of the child had stripped away her last illusion of superiority. David stared at Lisa, his heart hammering against his ribs in a heavy, painful rhythm. He looked at the woman he had discarded, searching for a trace of the fragile girl who had wept at his feet 5 years ago. He found nothing but a titan. She had not just survived his cruelty. She had conquered the wilderness, built an empire from the soil up, and raised 4 apex predators who made his seasoned court look like bickering children. A profound, agonizing wave of regret crashed over him. It was a physical ache, a tearing sensation in his chest. He had severed their mate bond to protect his pride, choosing a pliant, easily intimidated woman over the quiet, latent power of his true equal. Now, sitting beside his trembling queen, he realized with devastating clarity that he was the one who was truly impoverished. The dessert course was brought out by a procession of nervous servants. Silver platters of spun sugar and dark chocolate were placed delicately upon the tables, though few of the courtiers had the appetite to eat. The atmosphere was pulled so taut, it felt as though a single misplaced breath might snap it. David remained silent, drowning in the bitter realization of his own catastrophic miscalculations. He watched Lisa stroke Arthur's dark hair with a gentle, maternal grace. She was magnificent. She was the queen this pack desperately needed, and he had thrown her to the wolves. The disruption, when it came, did not originate from the royal table. It started near the heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the hall. A sudden, violent commotion shattered the polite murmur of the banquet. 4 heavily armed members of the royal guard, men whom David had personally promoted, suddenly drew their silver-forged broadswords. But they did not face outward to protect the hall. They turned inward. "The king is weak," shouted the captain of the guard, a burly wolf named Kalen. His eyes were wide with the fanaticism of a desperate rebellion. "He bleeds our borders for his pride, and lets stateless rogues insult our crown. The silver crest must be purged." Screams erupted as the rebel guards charged down the Crimson Runner, their weapons raised. The courtiers, caught entirely off guard and unarmed, scrambled away, overturning tables in a chaotic frenzy of shattered crystal and spilled wine. David leapt to his feet, a feral roar tearing from his throat. His alpha aura exploded outward, a frantic wave of aggression. He reached for his ceremonial sword, but it was strapped to the side of his throne, entangled in the heavy velvet drapes. Victoria screamed, curling her body over the sleeping Julian as the rebels closed the distance with terrifying speed. They were aiming directly for the royal family. "Guards!" David bellowed. But the loyal soldiers were stationed too far away, caught behind the stampede of terrified aristocrats. In the span of 3 seconds, David realized he was going to watch his new family be slaughtered because his own men no longer feared his authority. But the rebels never reached the dais. Lisa did not scream. She did not even stand up. She calmly lifted her teacup and took a slow sip. A blur of charcoal gray moved with impossible, terrifying velocity. The 4 boys, who had been sitting passively mere milliseconds before, synchronized into a flawless, tactical unit. Arthur and Caleb intercepted the 2 lead attackers. They did not shift into their wolf forms, nor did they utilize brute, tearing strength. Instead, they applied devastating kinetic logic. Arthur dropped to his knees, sliding across the polished marble, and struck the captain's right kneecap with the heel of his small, leather shoe at a precise, calculated angle. The sickening crack of shattering bone echoed over the screams. The captain collapsed, his sword flying from his grasp. Simultaneously, Caleb gripped the wrist of the second attacker, using the man's own forward momentum to flip the massive warrior entirely over his small shoulder. The rebel crashed into the marble floor with bone-rattling force, instantly unconscious. The remaining 2 attackers, momentarily stunned by the immediate dispatching of their leaders, hesitated. It was a fatal error. The 4th boy, Desmond, who had not spoken a single word all evening, vaulted over the royal dining table. He did not attack the rebels. Instead, he landed squarely in front of Victoria and the crying Julian. He stood with his back to the attackers, raising his small, impeccably tailored arms. A concentrated, localized pulse of alpha energy, so dense it distorted the air like heat over a highway. formed an invisible, protective dome over the trembling queen and her son. The rebels swung their swords at the boy's back, but the silver blades violently repelled off the atmospheric shield, jarring the weapons from their hands. Bennett stepped calmly between the disarmed men, his hands still clasped neatly behind his back. Your heart rates indicate elevated adrenaline, likely masking the micro-expressions of severe tactical regret. Bennett observed politely. I strongly suggest you surrender before my brothers calculate the precise force required to rupture your internal organs. The two men dropped to their knees, trembling violently, their eyes wide with unadulterated terror as they looked at the 5-year-old boys who had dismantled a coup in under 10 seconds. The hall fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Only the sound of Victoria's ragged sobbing and the groans of the injured captain filled the air. David stood frozen by his throne, his hand still reaching for a sword he had not been fast enough to draw. He stared at the boys. They had not shed a single drop of blood. They had neutralized a lethal threat using physics, leverage, and absolute emotional control. And Desmond had prioritized shielding Victoria, the woman who had replaced their mother. Their morality was as flawless as their power. Loyal guards finally flooded the hall, hauling the groaning rebels away in heavy iron chains. The courtiers slowly picked themselves up from the floor, their elaborate gowns and suits dusted with debris. No one spoke. Every gaze in the room was fixed on the 4 boys, who were calmly dusting off their charcoal jackets and returning to their seats as if they had merely paused to tie a shoelace. Desmond gave Victoria a polite, silent nod before turning his back on her, returning to his mother's side. Victoria remained huddled on the floor, staring at the child in profound, weeping awe. David slowly descended the steps of the dais. He felt incredibly old. The opulent pillars of his banquet hall felt like the bars of a golden cage. He walked past the overturned tables, ignoring the wide, staring eyes of his pack. He stopped a few feet from where Lisa was sitting, her teacup back in its saucer. The veneer of the Alpha King was completely gone. In its place stood a man, hollowed out by his own arrogance. "Lisa," David rasped. His voice broke, the sound raw and pathetic in the quiet hall. "Lisa, please." She looked up at him, her silver-gray eyes cool and unreadable. "Are you injured, Your Majesty?" she asked politely. "No," he choked out, falling to his knees. The gasp from the surrounding elders was deafening. The Alpha King, a man who bowed to no one, was kneeling before his banished, Barren mate. "No, I am not injured, but I am wrong. I was so incredibly wrong." He reached out, his trembling fingers hovering inches from the silk of her gown, terrified to actually touch her. "You are my mate. You always were. I let the whispers of the elders and the fear of my own legacy blind me. I see it now. I see what you are, what they are." He gestured frantically to the 4 boys. "They are my heirs. They are the future of the Silver Crest. Come back. Please, reclaim your title. You will be my queen, and they will rule this world." He didn't care that Victoria was listening. He didn't care about the politics anymore. He was a starving man who had just realized he had thrown away a feast to gnaw on bones. Lisa looked down at the man kneeling before her. There was no triumph in her expression, no vindictive joy at seeing her abuser brought low. There was only the same gentle maternal pity she had shown him since the beginning of the evening. "David," she said softly, her voice carrying an aching, insurmountable finality. "You cannot reclaim what you deliberately shattered." "I can fix it," he pleaded, desperation stripping away his dignity. "I can sever the bond with Victoria. I can make things right. And what of Julian?" Arthur's chiming voice cut through the air. The boy was staring at David with a look of profound disappointment. Will you discard him as easily as you discarded our mother? A king who treats his family as disposable assets is a liability, not a leader. David flinched as if he had been struck. The truth of the boy's words pinned him to the floor. Lisa stood up gracefully. The four boys instantly rose with her, falling into perfect synchronized formation at her sides. "I did not come here to conquer your kingdom, David," Lisa said, looking down at him. "I did not come to take your throne or to humiliate your new queen. I came because you needed to see the truth. You spent 5 years building a kingdom on the belief that I was broken. I needed you to understand that I was never broken. I was merely surviving the winter you forced me into." She stepped past him. "Your kingdom is yours, David. May it bring you the warmth you seek." She walked down the crimson runner, her emerald gown trailing behind her like a regal banner. Arthur, Bennett, Caleb, and Desmond walked with her, their chins held high, their auras a calm, untouchable fortress around their mother. As they walked past the courtiers, an extraordinary thing happened. Elder Marcus bowed his head. Then Lord Hastings followed. One by one, without a single word of command, the elite wolves of the Silver Crest Pack lowered their heads, bowing deeply in absolute, instinctual reverence to the departing queen and the 4 kings she had forged in the dark. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind them with a soft, final click. David remained kneeling on the cold marble floor, surrounded by his loyal subjects, his golden crown, and his chosen queen. Yet, as the scent of ozone and freezing mountain air faded from the hall, he had never been more acutely aware of the terrifying, echoing emptiness of his perfect life. True power is rarely found in the loudest roar, but in the quiet, undeniable strength of survival and logic. If you felt the chill of those 4 silver-eyed heirs and the devastating grace of a queen who needed no crown, please leave a like, share this story with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling, dramatic tales. Your support helps bring more cinematic and emotional worlds to life.